Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey, and welcome to this week's edition of Dispatch. So there were two main things that happened on Parliament Hill that I want to talk about that happened this week. First, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was in town. She came to the capital to set up her new Ottawa office. Some back and forth early in the week, again, on her environmental policies, but also on the series of restrictions she's proposing around trans youth access to care, pronouns in schools, and athletes participating in sport. And what really I wanted to fixate on is what kind of came after that. We heard early on from the NDP, from the Liberals, about what they thought of Danielle Smith's proposals. But Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, hadn't really articulated his position. That had been the case since his delegates back at their Quebec City convention in September proposed a series of new party planks, policies, around these issues. And Poilievre at the time said, you know, I'm going to read them up, study them, and then get back to you. Well, he hadn't got back to us until Wednesday, when finally he was before reporters. We were finally able to question him here on the Hill. You may have heard some of his press conferences, Montreal, Toronto earlier in the week, where they've set it up in a way where you get 5 questions between all the reporters, 1 question each, no follow-up. Scrums here on the Hill are different, and I think that's where we saw the difference this week. We were able to question Pierre Poilievre, colleagues of mine on the Hill, specifically about his position on what Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was proposing. The questions circled around the issue of access to what are called puberty blockers for minors. And Poilievre was quite clear. He believes that he wants to leave adult decisions up to adults, and that children should be protected, and that he was not supportive of this idea of having trans or non-binary youth access a puberty blocker under the age of 18. Doctors have come out to say a puberty blocker after the age of 18, there's little use in it. Why I'm kind of focusing on this week is because I think it is a first real bite of where Poilievre is going to stand on LGBTQ2S+ issues. It was an interesting perspective to hear. We spoke with some trans kids, their family members, as well. I had an interesting conversation this week with the Conservatives' first out trans candidate, who has since left the party, who said that she thinks Poilievre is playing with fire and has essentially decided to throw the trans community under the bus in order to satiate what she sees as the more far-right, true blue conservative part of his base. It's just going to be an interesting file to follow how he handles this as these issues come up. He accuses the Prime Minister of trying to divide Canadians and make this really a wedge issue. But it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out, if it impacts him in the polls. But more so, just we're finally into this period of time where we're getting to question and getting answers on where Pierre Poilievre stands. Some of his policies this week around other issues came to light. He had some announcements around First Nations rights and auto theft, which brings me to the other point I wanted to talk about in terms of what happened on the Hill this week. So the main event here took place on Thursday. It was, of course, this National Auto Theft Summit that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau convened, bringing in stakeholders, police forces, auto manufacturers, other stakeholders in the auto sector to talk about what they could do to combat what they're seeing right now as this scourge of auto thefts, car thefts across the country, seeing them put on shipping containers and sent across the world. And so kind of pre-positioning this, Poilievre had a series of announcements this week outlining what he would do. And then obviously the Prime Minister brought all of these officials together to talk about it here in Ottawa. And still to be seen exactly what's going to change. But they're talking about some new rules, restrictions, tougher penalties for car thieves, as well as trying to combat some of the tools and techniques that these car thieves use to access your cars. And in that, worth noting, the Prime Minister made a point of saying, you know, it's one thing to talk about slogans and you can put a jazzy YouTube video together. No shade on us. I'm sure he was talking about Pierre Poilievre. But you need to be able to find solutions, and some slogan isn't going to combat organized crime. So this new kind of focus on this issue from the Liberals is interesting. I kind of equate it to their focus on grocery prices last sitting, really picking on that kind of one, not populist issue, but a conversation that Canadians are having, an easily digestible example of how they want to show Canadians that they're addressing their concerns. So those are kind of the two files this week on the Hill that caught my eye. If you want to read more on either of these, always head over to ctvnews.ca/politics. We've got some in-depth coverage, getting more into the details of both Poilievre's position on trans rights, specifically trans kids' access to puberty blockers, and what the federal government and what Poilievre has proposed in terms of auto theft.
This is serious, that we expect the delivery of the legislation by the 1st of March, that we're serious about it. This is not a room where we have any additional time for delay, and I made it very clear of what we expect.
When you say you put the Prime Minister on notice, it suggests some sort of consequence. So
absolutely. There will be repercussions if the government doesn't follow through.
What specifically are those repercussions that you're talking about?
They'll see, but I made it very clear to the Prime Minister and to the Liberal government. If they don't follow through, there will be repercussions.
Does that include the possibility you don't support the confidence motion that would follow the federal budget in the spring?
We're not going to discuss the repercussions now, but we made it very clear to them, and they're aware of what the repercussions could be.
A few weeks ago, you said you were confident a deal would be made. Anne McGrath said that. Are you still confident a deal is going to be made by March 1st, or is there backsliding?
Well, I'm an optimist in general, but the meeting was a difficult meeting. It was not an easy meeting, and we made it very clear what we want and what we expect. So it was a tough meeting, and we made our demands very clear and our expectations very clear. The Prime Minister and the Liberal government now know where we stand, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, so you heard there, that is NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh not mincing any words. This was in reference to what he said was a conversation Singh had with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau early this week about the state of their supply and confidence deal. And I picked this as my quote of the week because for a while now, and if you've been watching these, you know I'm tracking the longevity or the progress of this supply and confidence agreement, the deal that essentially the NDP are helping prop up the Liberals to keep them in power. And what we're hearing here from Singh is quite literally the most frank, direct he's been about where their red line is and if he is ready to pull out of the deal. Now, you know, a lot of people will say the NDP have become a bit like Chicken Little on this deal, threatening things and then staying in the deal because the Liberals find some way to appease them. But I think this was a really interesting quote and will be clipped and saved because if this is the case, that the Liberals don't make good on their pharmacare promise by the March 1st deadline, the pressure will be on. You know, Jagmeet Singh said he's done, we're out. So we will be holding him to that. Or what sort of compromise could we see between now and then to keep the deal alive if the bill, as they've both agreed to, doesn't materialize? I just think this is going to be a really interesting file to follow. Because if we're into a conversation about a potential election sooner rather than later, that really does change dynamics for all the parties. It changes the dynamics on the Hill. It changes the dynamics about all of them rolling out their policy proposals to kind of put them to Canadians. And I just think it was, a bit of a warning shot maybe from NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. We're hearing some whispers behind the scenes as well about them all getting ready for this. I was with them at their caucus retreat in Edmonton, and they were very clear that pharmacare is their number one priority. It was going to be the first test of the deal in 2024, and we're watching that play out now. As for what I'm going to be watching next week, on Monday, Auditor General Karen Hogan is going to be releasing a performance audit on the government's controversial ArriveCAN app. So AG Hogan was tasked to look at a number of elements of this app in light of some allegations about contracting misconduct. You may have caught some of this. There's been some parliamentary studies. Questions have been raised about how the contracts were granted and who actually did the work in terms of developing this app. This app initially was used in the COVID era, but the government has kind of revived it since, or modernized it or changed it a bit to be focused on kind of a, when you get back to the border, fill out your information. And so I'm going to be watching this because I think this file has kind of been simmering under the radar. Some of my colleagues have been keeping a closer eye on this, and it could really come up as the next potential scandal or controversy the government's going to have to face. Typically how this works, if an AG releases a report, we would hear from the relevant ministers later in the day. So watch for that on Monday. We'll be first waiting to hear about what AG Hogan finds in terms of the mispractice potentially about how this app was developed, contracted, whether it was in the best financial interest, all of the little elements that an Auditor General would consider. We'll get that first. And then we'll be hearing from federal ministers responding. Usually what they do is promise that they'll make changes and they accept recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. But if this report is damning and kind of confirms some of the conversations we've been hearing on the Hill about the contractors and the work they did, this could become a pretty hot file for the federal government.